At 3:51 in the morning on October 25, 1944, in the narrow black water of Surigao Strait in the central Philippines, 8 American radar screens locked onto 2 blips moving north at 18 knots. The range was 22,800 yards, roughly 13 miles, and closing. On the other end of those blips sat 2 Japanese battleships, a heavy cruiser, and a scattering of destroyers, all that remained of a force that had entered the strait 90 minutes earlier at nearly double that number. They did not know they were being watched. They did not know that ahead of them, drawn across the mouth of the strait in a line 11 miles long, sat 6 American battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, waiting in the dark with their guns already laid. At 3:52, the battleship USS West Virginia fired the first salvo of 8 16-inch shells. It struck home. Within the next half hour, the last battle line of dreadnoughts in naval history would open fire on an enemy that could not see them, could not range them, and in most cases, could not even locate the source of the fire tearing their ships apart. It was not, by any honest definition, a battle. It was an execution, conducted with radar, precision, and an 11-mile head start. Here is the detail almost nobody watching the gun flashes that night could have known, and the one that gives this story its second layer. 5 of the 6 American battleships standing across that strait had been sunk or crippled at Pearl Harbor by this same Japanese Navy, almost exactly 3 years earlier. West Virginia had settled to the harbor floor with a torpedo-torn hull. California had gone down at her moorings. Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had all taken bomb or shell damage that put them out of the war for months. Salvage crews had pulled most of them off the mud of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt them from the waterline up, and sent them back to sea. Now, on the night of October 25th, they were standing in a line across a Philippine strait, radar-directed, fully armed, and about to fire on Japanese warships for the first and only time in the war. That is not coincidence in the loose sense people use the word. That is a specific, verifiable arrangement of hulls that nobody planned and nobody could have. But the ships did not know their own history that night, and neither did the men on the other end of their guns. To understand how it happened, the story does not start at 3:52 in the morning. It starts nearly 18 hours earlier and 400 miles to the west, with a plan that was already failing before the first shot was fired. By October of 1944, Japan's naval position in the Pacific had become close to hopeless, and its high command knew it. The invasion of Leyte was the opening move in the recapture of the Philippines, and if MacArthur's forces were allowed to establish themselves ashore, Japan's supply line to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies would be permanently severed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, authorized a plan called Shogo, or Victory Operation, built on a premise that would have sounded absurd in 1942 and was now simply the only option left. Japan no longer had the carrier air power to contest Leyte Gulf directly, so its remaining carriers, nearly stripped of aircraft, would be sent north as a decoy to pull the American Third Fleet's covering force away from the landing beaches. While Halsey chased empty flight decks, 2 separate surface forces would converge on Leyte Gulf itself from opposite directions and destroy the invasion fleet and its transports at anchor. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force, built around the battleships Yamato and Musashi, would come through San Bernardino Strait from the north. A smaller southern force would come through Surigao Strait from the south. 2 pincers, converging on the same undefended beachhead at roughly the same hour. It was an intricate plan built by a navy that no longer had the ships, the aircraft, or the fuel reserves to execute intricate plans, and it depended on precise timing between forces that, as this account will make plain, were never given the means to coordinate with each other at all. Toyota himself was reported to have described the operation, in substance if not in exact wording, as Japan's last opportunity to strike a decisive blow before its remaining fleet was worn down piecemeal by American production it could no longer hope to match. Whatever the precise phrasing, the sentiment behind Shogo was unmistakably one of a navy gambling its last significant surface strength on a single throw, because the alternative was watching that strength erode in port for want of fuel and pilots. Every element of the plan, from the decoy carriers sent north with almost no aircraft aboard, to the surface forces converging from two directions with no shared communications plan, reflected an organization improvising a strategy several tiers below the ambition it was still trying to execute. The Southern Force belonged to Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, a 55-year-old destroyer specialist, with a reputation for aggressiveness and a career built mostly on smaller, faster ships. His command for Shogo was built around two battleships that were already relics when the war began. Fuso and Yamashiro were sister ships of the Fuso class, laid down in 1912 and 1913, commissioned in 1915 and 1917, the first Japanese-designed and Japanese-built battleships in history. By 1944, both were nearly 30 years old, twice rebuilt, and instantly recognizable for their strange, top-heavy pagoda superstructures, stacked with a decade of bolted-on fire control platforms that had never been part of the original design. Each carried 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, respectable firepower on paper, but their fire control systems were optical, dependent on a human eye squinting through a rangefinder in total darkness, against an enemy that would be tracking them by radar the entire engagement. Nishimura's force also included the heavy cruiser Mogami, herself a survivor of an earlier collision disaster at the Battle of Midway, and 4 destroyers, Michishio, Asagumo, Yamagumo, and Shigure. Nishimura ran a tight, unsentimental command. His orders to the force were simple and did not invite discussion. Proceed through Surigao Strait, engage whatever stood in the way, and reach Leyte Gulf by dawn regardless of losses. There was no allowance in that order for the possibility that reaching the objective might not be the same as achieving the mission. Nishimura's own record supported that reputation for aggressiveness. Earlier in the war, he had pressed destroyer forces into engagements other commanders would have declined, and Shogo's planners appear to have selected him for the Southern Force precisely because his instinct in a crisis was to keep advancing rather than to withdraw and regroup. That same instinct, which had served him adequately commanding fast, expendable destroyers, was about to be applied to 2 irreplaceable battleships with nowhere to hide in a 9-mile-wide strait. It is worth being precise about what Nishimura's force actually represented within the wider Shogo plan, because it was never intended to fight alone. On paper, his battleships and Shima's cruisers together formed a single Southern force with real combined firepower. In practice, the 2 commanders had operated under separate chains of authority for most of the war, and the last-minute decision to fold Shima's ships under a coordinated Southern pincer was a paper arrangement that never received the training, the shared codebooks, or the rehearsal time that might have made it function under fire. The crews aboard Fuso and Yamashiro were not the green, hastily trained sailors who crewed many of Japan's later war ships. Both battleships had spent nearly 3 decades in commission, and a meaningful core of their petty officers and gunnery crews were career men who had trained on these same turrets for years. What they lacked was not competence but equipment. Neither ship had ever received the kind of dedicated fire control radar that had become standard on American battleships by 1944. Both were still relying on optical rangefinders that required a visible target and reasonable light, conditions that would not exist that night. It is a specific and quantifiable technological gap, not a vague difference in quality, and it is the single largest reason the coming engagement would be as one-sided as it was. Roughly 40 kilometers behind Nishimura, and never in direct communication with him for most of the approach, came a second Japanese force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Ashigara, and 4 destroyers. Shima and Nishimura were not part of the same task organization until very late in the planning. They were not given a shared communications plan adequate to coordinate a night action, and the 2 admirals had a personal history of friction dating back years. Shogo called for their 2 forces to transit Surigao Strait in a coordinated, mutually supporting attack. In practice, strict radio silence, imposed to avoid revealing the operation before it began, meant Nishimura had almost no reliable picture of where Shima's ships actually were. This was not a minor administrative gap. It was a command failure built into the plan from the start, and it meant that whatever happened to Nishimura's force in the strait, Shima's ships would arrive as strangers to the battle, discovering its outcome rather than shaping it. There is also a bitter irony sitting underneath the entire Southern Forces mission. The old dreadnought, the type of ship these 2 battleships represented, the slow, heavily armored, big-gun capital ship, built to slug it out in a daylight line of battle, had already been made obsolete by carrier aviation 2 years earlier at Midway. Fuso and Yamashiro were about to fight the last engagement of their kind in history, in a war that had already moved past them. Waiting for Nishimura at the northern end of the strait was a man whose name history remembers far less than it should. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the bombardment and fire support group of the U.S. 7th Fleet, and when American intelligence identified 2 separate Japanese forces converging on Surigao Strait, he was handed one of the cleanest tactical gifts a naval commander can receive: a narrow, funnel-shaped body of water, with only one way through, and enough time to prepare for it. Oldendorf built his defense in depth, layer by layer, the way an engineer builds a filter meant to strip something down piece by piece before it reaches the far end. First came a screen of 39 PT boats spread across the strait's southern approaches, whose job was not to sink anything, but to spot the Japanese force early and report its position, course, and speed. Behind them, arranged along both shores in ambush positions, sat 2 destroyer squadrons and a separate destroyer division, 28 ships in total, tasked with independent torpedo attacks designed to whittle the Japanese line down before it ever came in range of the big guns. And at the very back of the funnel, drawn across its mouth in a classic crossing maneuver, sat Oldendorf's battle line, the 6 old battleships, backed by 8 cruisers. Oldendorf did have one real constraint to work around. His battleships had spent the preceding weeks firing shore bombardment ammunition in support of the Leyte landings, and several of them were now critically low on the armor-piercing shells needed for a ship-to-ship gunnery duel, a detail that would shape exactly how long and how carefully he was willing to let his battle line keep firing once the engagement began. Oldendorf was not a flamboyant commander and left little in the way of a public legend. He had spent much of the earlier Pacific campaign as an unglamorous specialist in shore bombardment, the kind of assignment that rarely produces headlines, and he brought that same methodical, almost administrative temperament to the defense of Surigao Strait. There was nothing improvised about what he built. Every squadron had a sector, a firing sequence, and a withdrawal lane worked out in advance, so that no American ship would be caught in the crossfire of another American ship in the confusion of a night action, a real and serious risk in an engagement fought almost entirely by radar in pitch darkness. What he built that night was simply a machine for destroying a battle line before it could return effective fire, and it worked with almost mechanical precision. At 10:36 p.m. on October 24th, the PT boats got their first look at Nishimura's force entering the strait and began radioing contact reports up the chain. Over the next several hours, one PT boat squadron after another closed in, fired torpedoes that mostly missed or were evaded, and peeled away under a storm of Japanese secondary gunfire that damaged several boats and wounded a number of crewmen, but sank nothing. In pure material terms, the PT boat attacks accomplished almost nothing. In every other sense, they accomplished everything Oldendorf needed. Nishimura now knew, beyond doubt, that the strait ahead was defended, and that the Americans knew exactly where he was. He had lost surprise completely, 3 hours before he would reach the battle line, and he pressed on anyway. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the moment's history quietly erases restored to the record, this channel exists for exactly that reason, and there is a great deal more of this battle still to come. What followed was a systematic dismantling carried out almost entirely in darkness, phase by ships the Japanese frequently never saw. Shortly before 3 a.m., Destroyer Squadron 54, under Captain Jesse Coward, moved in from the eastern shore and launched a coordinated torpedo attack against the head of the Japanese column. At least one, and by some accounts several, torpedoes struck Fuso amidships. The old battleship began to burn, her speed falling away, and within roughly 15 minutes, between about 3:38 and 3:50 a.m., she went under, taking most of her crew of some 1,600 men down with her. Only 10 survivors would be pulled from the water. For decades afterward, the popular account of this moment held that Fuso broke cleanly in half and drifted as 2 separate burning wrecks for hours afterward, a striking, cinematic image that made its way into book after book and documentary after documentary. Later, more rigorous research into Japanese survivor testimony and American reconnaissance photography has made a stronger case that Fuso in fact sank essentially intact, in one piece, within minutes of the fatal hits, and that what later observers saw and misidentified as 2 halves of Fuso were most likely the bow and stern sections of a different wreck entirely. The popular version says Fuso burned in 2 pieces until dawn. The better supported record says she was gone in under 20 minutes. Almost simultaneously, a second destroyer, McDermott, fired a spread of torpedoes that hit 3 separate ships in a single pass, the most successful torpedo salvo any American destroyer would achieve in the entire war. The destroyer Yamagumo took a hit and blew apart almost instantly. Michishio was struck and left dead in the water, sinking not long after, with only 4 of her crew surviving. Asagumo took a hit to her bow, which was torn away, though she remained afloat and underway, crippled. Within about 20 minutes of the first torpedo attacks, the Japanese Southern Force had lost 1 battleship and 2 destroyers, and had a 3rd destroyer critically damaged, without a single American ship taking a hit in return. At 3:30 a.m., with 2/3 of his force already gone, Nishimura radioed Kurita and Shima that his ships had been torpedoed but remained fit for battle and continued north. It is difficult to overstate how deliberate that decision was. He had clear, direct evidence that the strait ahead was a kill zone and that his force had already been gutted, and he chose to press the survivors forward into it regardless, in exact compliance with an order that had never anticipated retreat as an option. 10 minutes later, a second destroyer squadron under Captain Roland Smoot struck the remaining Japanese ships from the opposite flank, and Yamashiro absorbed at least 1 more torpedo hit without her speed dropping significantly, a testament to just how much punishment the old ship could still take. Throughout this second wave of attacks, Japanese lookouts strained to identify targets they could barely see, returning fire in the general direction of muzzle flashes and torpedo wakes rather than at any confirmed contact, while the American destroyers worked from radar plots that told them almost exactly where every Japanese ship sat in relation to their own. It was, in the most literal sense, a fight between a force that could see and a force that could not. By this point, Nishimura had, in effect, 1 battleship, 1 badly damaged cruiser, 1 crippled destroyer, and 1 intact destroyer, Shigure, left under his command, and he was still driving north into the strait's narrowest point. What awaited him there was Oldendorf's battle line, laid perfectly across his path in the classic maneuver every gunnery officer studies, and almost none ever gets to execute against a real enemy. Crossing the T, positioning your own ship so that every gun in your line can fire, while the approaching enemy, strung out in column, can only bring its forward turrets to bear. At 3:51 and 3:52 a.m., West Virginia, followed within seconds by California and Tennessee, opened fire at over 22,000 yards using radar fire control that could resolve range and bearing to a degree the Japanese optical rangefinders simply could not match in the dark. Within the space of roughly 21 minutes, 3 of the 6 American battleships fired more than 90 16-inch shells at Yamashiro and the retreating Mogami, while the cruiser line added a storm of 8-inch and 6-inch fire on top of it. Mississippi, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, hampered by older fire control gear or simply unable to get a clean radar lock in the crowded, smoke-choked strait, fired far less. In Pennsylvania's case, not at all. It did not need to be more even than that. Witnesses on both sides described Yamashiro as burning like a furnace, her superstructure lit from within, shells finding her again and again with almost nothing coming back the other way. Somewhere in the middle of that 21 minutes, Shigure, alone among Nishimura's ships, still capable of independent action, turned and ran for open water, becoming the sole vessel of the Southern Forces Strike Group to survive the direct gunnery engagement. Even inside a slaughter, there is room to record what discipline under those conditions actually looked like, without dressing it up. Yamashiro's gunners kept working their turrets and continued returning fire, however ineffectually, for as long as the ship had power to train them, and her crew maintained damage control stations deep in a hull that both American radar and American shells had already mapped completely. That is not heroism in the sentimental sense the word usually carries in these stories. It is simply what professional sailors did on a doomed ship because it was their job. At around 4:19 a.m., after taking a final concentration of torpedo hits, Yamashiro capsized and sank with almost her entire crew of roughly 1,600 men aboard, including Nishimura himself and his chief of staff, both of whom remained on the bridge to the end. No radio transmission, no final signal, and no eyewitness account exists to tell us what either man said or thought in Yamashiro's last minutes, and no honest account of this battle should pretend otherwise. What can be said with confidence, because it comes from the handful of men who survived the sinking and were later interviewed, is that the order to abandon ship was given calmly and in proper sequence, and that discipline aboard the battleship held to the very end, even as the compartments below the waterline flooded faster than any damage control party could have kept pace with. That is the moment this whole story has been circling back to since the opening minute. 5 of the 6 battleships that fired on Yamashiro that night, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, had been sunk, grounded, or severely damaged in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, almost exactly 3 years earlier. Only Mississippi among the 6 had not been present that day. These were not replacement hulls built to avenge that morning. They were, in most cases, the literal same steel, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, patched, rebuilt, and fitted with the radar fire control systems that had not existed when they went down the first time, which is precisely what let them do to Yamashiro at 22,000 yards what the Japanese Navy had done to them at point-blank range inside their own anchorage. Nobody in Oldendorf's chain of command engineered that symmetry, and nobody on either side that night was thinking about Pearl Harbor while the shells were in the air. But it happened anyway, a genuine and fully documented coincidence of history, sitting quietly beneath one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the entire war. While Yamashiro was dying at the northern end of the strait, A second, largely unrelated disaster was unfolding roughly 200 miles to the north, and it deserves to be told alongside this one, because it kept the American victory at Surigao Strait from ever being the clean story it looks like in isolation. Kurita's center force, the other half of the Japanese pincer, had not been intercepted or destroyed the way Nishimura's had. It had slipped through San Bernardino Strait, largely unopposed, because Halsey's Third Fleet had taken the bait of Japan's decoy carriers and steamed north to chase them, leaving the strait guarding Leyte Gulf's other flank essentially open. In the early morning hours of the same day Yamashiro sank, Kurita's force, still built around powerful battleships and heavy cruisers, fell on a thin screen of American escort carriers and destroyers off the island of Samar, ships never designed or armed to fight a battle line at all. Those destroyers charged Kurita's battleships regardless, in one of the most lopsided and costly actions of the Pacific War, buying time with their own destruction, while the escort carriers' planes and a rain of American good fortune eventually convinced Kurita to break off and withdraw. None of that was Oldendorf's failure, and none of it belongs to Nishimura's story in the sense of blame. It belongs here as a reminder that the same morning produced a triumphant, nearly bloodless American victory in one strait and a desperate, costly near catastrophe in another, separated by a few hours and 200 miles of the same ocean. Laid out in sequence, the night reads like this. At 10:36 p.m. on October 24th, American PT boats made first contact with Nishimura's force entering Surigao Strait. Just before 3 a.m. on the 25th, Destroyer Squadron 54 torpedoed Fuso, which sank within roughly 15 minutes. Around the same time, McDermott's torpedo spread sank Yamagumo and Michishio and crippled Asagumo. By 3:30 a.m., Nishimura reported his losses to Kurita and Shima and continued north regardless. At 3:51 and 3:52 a.m., Oldendorf's battleships opened fire on Yamashiro at over 22,000 yards. Within about 21 minutes, Yamashiro was reduced to a burning wreck, and at 4:19 a.m., she capsized and sank with Nishimura aboard. At 4:25 a.m., Shima's force finally arrived, found only wreckage, and withdrew. The following morning, aircraft caught and sank the damaged cruiser Mogami, the sixth and final major warship lost by the Japanese Southern Force in barely 18 hours. Several distinct factors, stacked on top of each other, produced an outcome this lopsided. The first was technology. American radar fire control could find and range a target in total darkness with a precision Japanese optical rangefinders simply could not match, which meant the battle line was, in effect, fighting a blind opponent from the opening shot. The second was terrain, or rather the geography Oldendorf was handed. A narrow, funnel-shaped strait, with only one viable channel, meant Nishimura's ships had no room to maneuver around the ambush, and no alternate route once committed. The third was command failure on the Japanese side, both in the near-total absence of coordination between Nishimura and Shima's forces, and in Nishimura's own decision to keep advancing after his force had already been effectively destroyed, in strict but arguably mechanical obedience to orders that assumed a level of success no longer possible. The fourth was preparation. Oldendorf had hours of advance warning and used every one of them to build a layered defense, while Nishimura had only the information his shrinking force could gather under fire. And the fifth was simple material mismatch, an American force outnumbering and outgunning its opponent from the moment contact was made, against two battleships that had been technologically obsolete before the war even began. None of these factors operated in isolation. The technological gap made the terrain more lethal than it would otherwise have been, because a force that could have spotted an ambush visually in daylight was effectively blind to it at night. The command failure between Nishimura and Shima meant that whatever numerical advantage a coordinated approach might have offered was never realized, and the material mismatch simply set the ceiling on how much any single factor could have changed the outcome, even if the others had gone differently. Taken together, they describe not a single mistake, but a compounding failure, the kind that turns a difficult mission into an impossible one before the first shot is even fired. Surigao Strait holds a distinction that will never be repeated, because the conditions that produced it no longer exist and never will again. It was the last time in naval history that battleships fired on other battleships in a purely surface gunnery duel. The last time one fleet successfully crossed the T of an opposing battle line, and effectively, the closing chapter of an entire form of warfare that had defined naval power for the better part of a century. Within a decade, the battleship itself would be functionally retired as the dominant weapon of the sea, replaced entirely by carrier aviation and eventually guided missiles. Fuso and Yamashiro did not simply lose a battle that night. They fought and lost the final engagement of a kind of warfare that had already been quietly ending around them for 2 years, and few of the men firing those guns in the dark had any sense that they were closing out an entire era of naval combat rather than simply winning one more fight in a very long war. The aftermath was as unsentimental as the battle itself. Of Yamashiro's crew of roughly 1,600 men, only a small number survived. Of Fuso's similarly sized crew, only 10. Michishio lost all but 4 of her men. Mogami, hit repeatedly and further damaged in a collision with Shima's flagship Nachi during the confused retreat, limped south through the morning before American aircraft finally caught and sank her, closing out the 6th and final loss of the engagement. Shigure, the one destroyer to survive the direct gunnery action, made it back to Japanese-held waters, only to be sunk months later by an American submarine in the Gulf of Thailand. A fate that meant every one of Nishimura's original 7 warships was eventually lost before the war ended. On the American side, the cost was remarkably small. A handful of PT boats damaged, a few dozen sailors wounded, and not a single major warship lost in the entire engagement. The wrecks of Fuso and Yamashiro remain on the floor of Surigao Strait to this day, largely undisturbed, identified in recent years through sonar surveys that have finally begun to settle long-standing arguments about exactly how and where each ship went down. There is no American memorial at the site, and no Japanese one either, only the wrecks themselves. 100 fathoms down in water, most people who cross the Philippines by ferry have no idea they are sailing over. Admiral Oldendorf himself went on to command fire support forces in the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, retired from the Navy in 1948, and died in 1974, having never written a memoir or sought the kind of public recognition that fell to more flamboyant commanders of the same war. Most naval histories of Leyte Gulf spend far more time on Halsey's pursuit of the Japanese decoy carriers to the north, or on the desperate stand of the escort carriers off Samar, than on the strait, where an entire Japanese battle force was destroyed in a single night for almost no American cost. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Shima, who had arrived too late to effect the battle and withdrawn his own force largely intact, survived the war, was never seriously blamed for the disaster that overtook Nishimura, and lived until 1977, one of a small number of senior Japanese naval commanders from Leyte Gulf who did not go down with their ships or take their own lives in the war's final year. That is the pattern this channel exists to dig up. The version of a famous night that the popular account leaves out. The coincidence nobody engineered. The command failure nobody wants to name plainly. And the ordinary men on both sides who did their jobs inside a battle that was effectively decided before most of them ever fired a shot. If stories like this, the real, documented history behind the events people think they already know, are what you're here for. Subscribing costs nothing, and make sure the next one finds you. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching this from. And if you already knew about Fuso and Yamashiro before tonight, say so, because most people don't.